causing a hubbub, security difficulties getting into the room. We're starting a little bit late. And I expect we'll have some more folks coming in who are stuck at the appointments desk right now. So please let people into these seats as they come in. We'll get started. So welcome. This is the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, which is a joint venture of R Street Institute and New America. For more than 2 years, we've been holding monthly meetings over on the Hill. We are here to help staff think about institutional issues surrounding Congress, and we love to hear from staff about what you want to see with this event. So if you have some comment cards on your seat, please don't be shy about filling those out and handing them out. My name is Philip Wallach. I'm a senior fellow at the R Street Institute in our governance program. I think about making Congress great again, which is the mission of our governance program at R Street. I'm joined today by 3 experts on trade policy because we're going to focus on the very live issue of how Congress involves itself in decisions about implementing new tariffs. You have 2 papers on your seats, one of which is a longer one by Clark Packard, who's sitting over to my left there, and we put out in the fall, sort of taking stock of how Congress gave so much of its authority to the executive branch in terms of setting trade policy and looking at options for reform today. And we're going to focus, especially but not only today, on Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gives the president the power to implement tariffs justified by national security considerations. And so the other small paper you have is just a short one looking at 2 of the leading competing reform bills, S-287 and S-365, which are both in the Senate Finance Committee now, and what those would do. So we'll hear more from our panelists about that. So I'll just briefly introduce all 3 of our panelists, and then we'll go down the line and hear some brief opening statements from them, and then have a discussion. So to my left is Haley Craig, Legislative Assistant for Senator Pat Toomey. Next is Clark Packard, who's Trade Policy Counsel at R Street. And finally, Hannah Greenberg, who's Chief of Staff for Representative Ron Kind. So let's just go one after the other and have very quick statements so we sort of have a chance to do a little bit of discussion before Hannah has to leave.
I guess I can start off. I think Senator Toomey has introduced, obviously, legislation to rein in the use of Section 232 specifically, but we kind of see the bill, and it would essentially require that Congress approve any 232 actions on the front end before they can even take effect. We kind of see the bill as getting at 2 problems. So one is really the immediate term, which is the current use of Section 232, and we do feel that the statute has been misused, that there really is not a clear national security justification for the steel and aluminum tariffs, and certainly not for the impending potential tariffs on autos. I think most people have seen by now Secretary Mattis's comments on the 232 investigation, stating that we can meet our defense needs with 3% of domestic steel and aluminum production. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of folks in the aluminum industry, with a few exceptions, oppose the tariffs, and obviously there's significant downstream harm. So that's kind of the immediate problem. But then we also look at this long term as a constitutional question. So since 1934, roughly, Congress has slowly shifted a lot of its constitutional responsibilities over trade to the executive branch via various statutes. And I know 232 isn't the only one out there. Obviously, there's 301, which we see with the China tariffs. There's IEPA. So just a number of different kind of ways that Congress has really abdicated its role on trade policy. And I think when we look at this, we want to be able to address it in a way that gives Congress more say over trade in a way that also kind of biases the outcome towards free trade and makes it harder for anyone to impose tariffs. So our bill basically says going forward, Anytime the executive branch wants to take a 232 action, they have to come to Congress and make that case to Congress, and then Congress votes. If the approval resolution passes, then fine, the tariffs can take effect, but otherwise, they don't go into place. So the outcome is really biased towards no tariffs, unless there's obviously, a certain national security threshold or argument that's legitimate and can be made, because you would need the executive branch and the House and the Senate to all agree. We think that goes a long way, kind of, again, in shifting the decision-making power to Congress where, frankly, it should be, without kind of taking us back to the times of Smoot-Hawley when Congress was in control of setting every single tariff rate.
Great. So just to kind of echo Haley's point there, I mean, if you look back at the history of the delegation of authority, I mean, it became apparent very quickly after Smoot-Hawley that was the last time that Congress basically went tariff line by tariff line and debated Smoot-Hawley for 18 months. And it was, I think they spent like 6 straight months in the Senate debating it, and it became very apparent that Congress has institutional problems. It's easily captured by domestic industry, and sort of parochialism it guides the way Congress has traditionally set trade policy. But sort of from the ashes of Smoot-Hawley, we got policy right. I mean, there was a broad gentleman's agreement between the branches that Congress was incapable of doing this, so they started to delegate to the executive branch. And that gentleman's agreement worked, roughly, for 80 years. The United States has had good trade policy, very liberalizing trade policy. But that started to break down in the sense that the dynamic now is that you have good free trading members of Congress, their bosses in particular are probably 2 of the best, but then you have an executive branch that is much more protectionist than the Congress. So I'm thinking about, and sort of my research in the past and going forward, is so the Trump issue poses problems, but also how do we take a step back and sort of extricate ourselves from the fire in front of us, which is the Trump White House, and how do we try to think about or conceptualize this balance going forward? So thanks for everyone coming, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thanks. I can't begin to express how happy I am that this conversation is taking place in the context of talking about legislative and government reform. Because when you look back to the decisions made by Congress in the wake of the Great Depression, during World War II, leading into a number of other international conflicts, you see decades and decades of Congress giving over to the president a lot of Article I authority. This is a problem that both parties have intermittently cared about, depending on who was in the White House. It goes back long before the last presidency and long before this one. It goes back much further than a national security declaration on our southern border. It goes back a lot farther than unilateral tariffs. But what we're seeing now is sort of a culminating effect of 75, 80 years of this paradigm that Clark was talking about, where when you believe that all parties are acting rationally, the larger your constituency, the easier it is for them to make tougher trade decisions. And what we see now is a presidency that really turns that paradigm on its head and asks members of Congress, really demands members of Congress to stop passing the buck over to the president, and really demands that they start really thinking more thoughtfully in a more nuanced way about these issues. My hope is that this represents an opportunity for a reset, in particular in the Democratic Party, that has drifted away from a lot of these policies. But I think what you see now is the dovetailing of interests. And we're not 100% there yet, but how do you take the left wing of the Democratic Party that's skeptical of the border wall emergency declaration and merge them with the traditional free trade communities in the Republican Party and ask them to come to the same conclusion? And that's why I think that it's really important that this conversation happen in the context of congressional modernization, because we did make a decision after Smoot-Hawley that Congress was incapable of following its Article I authorities. But the reality is, no matter how much we delegate it to the president, the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations belongs to Congress, and Congress is alone. Congressman Conley is a lead co-sponsor of Senator Toomey's bill. He is also the author in the House of Senator Portman's bill. Both are 232 specific, but his general view is that which he set out last year and what was really more of a rhetorical exercise in trying to say that Congress has a right to involve itself in every trade decision made by the president that is trade restricting. We have made it easy for the president to trade restrict on his own because we assumed he wouldn't do it. Now that we're here, we really need to look at those authorities and try to create an analog to maybe what we do in the trade liberalization space with Trade Promotion Authority, where we can put guardrails on the president and we can really assert our authority as the Article 1 power to move forward in a way that doesn't completely ignore what Congress wants. If trade votes are hard in Congress, it's because a lot of Congress feels like they weren't appropriately consulted from the front end. That's a traditional problem with FTAs, and with these tariffs, their consultation was even less. So we need to figure out how to bring these sides together and have a conversation about congressional authority and how to reassert it. And trade is, I think, part of a much larger conversation than that front. And I'm hopeful that conversations like this, with organizations such as both of yours, and taking it out of the specific trade context will be helpful in that regard.
So let me just ask you, Hannah, to talk a little bit about the Portman bill that you said Representative Kind is sponsoring in the House. So that's the Trade Security Act, if I'm not mistaken. So what does that get Congress in terms of injecting it into the process? How would that sort of change its institutional position relative to the status quo?
It would create a disapproval instead of an approval process. And the congressman kind of pedaling back a little bit further in time, last Congress introduced something we call the Trade Authority Protection Act. And some of you may be familiar with Senator Lee's bill. So it used a similar definition of what a trade restricting, a congressionally delegated trade authority was. So this was a very broad set of actions. And for those, we said Congress had the ability to shut off rather than turn on actions of the president. And we introduced that with former Congressman Charlie Dent. And the goal was always a shot across the bow. And the congressman believed it's very important that Congress start asserting its authorities again. And as I mentioned, this is not unique to him in the trade space. He thinks it's really important that Congress get back in the practice of acting like the Article 1 body that it is. So for him, it was always about getting that muscle memory right. And we're not going to do it all at once. The congressman is very much an incrementalist in most senses of the term. So for us, it was really important to sort of get us back in the muscle memory of realizing that these don't belong to the president. These authorities belong to Congress. And if the president doesn't feel that way, it is the congressman's view that a half step that reminds him of that is better than us introducing legislation that can't go anywhere. And we're not sure exactly where we're going to be yet. I think that from what I can tell, and I'll let Hallie talk about this a little bit better, conversations are productive over on the Senate side on this. We are optimistic we can move legislation forward that hits a landing zone that can bring a large swath of Congress on board. And frankly, the congressman wants that more than he wants any individual provision. He thinks it's just critically important that we start taking these authorities and treating them as ours and not the president's.
Can I just jump in? Yeah, so I completely agree. That's Senator Toomey's view as well. I mean, we've put out a proposal that we think is a strong one on 232, but at the end of the day, right, the goal is to get something across the finish line, and I think that anything that has teeth is going to need a veto-proof majority. We did have kind of a proxy vote in the Senate last summer that was just simply kind of a sense of the Senate that Congress should have a role in 232. And remember, this was like almost a year ago at this point, and I think we've definitely reached more of a breaking point on the tariffs. So, but even then, we got 88 Senate votes in favor. So that should give you some idea of where members stand, even if they have specific thoughts on maybe 232 for steel or uranium or whatever it is, titanium sponge. On the constitutional question, I think it's harder to disagree. I would just comment quickly on the disapproval versus the approval mechanism, because I think it's a little bit boring, but I think it's a really, really important important procedural distinction, and I would posit that the approval procedure in Senator Toomey's legislation would be more effective at biasing the outcome towards free trade and no tariffs. So the disapproval resolution in the kind and Portman proposal, well, I think it's an important signaling device. It also doesn't have privilege. The way, for example, the disapproval resolution with the National Emergencies Act, which we're seeing play out now, has some type of legislative procedural privilege, right? So once it's introduced, there's a way that it can get to the floor. Under the 232 statute right now already does have a disapproval resolution in it. It's only for petroleum. Congress has tried and failed to use it before. The Portman proposal just strikes the word petroleum, so it would apply to all imports. But I guess if you think about the procedural hurdles, if you try and kind of weaponize that disapproval resolution, you'd have to use it after the fact. So the burden is on Congress to try and overturn tariffs that have already been in place and presumably have some kind of, constituent interest now lobbying for them, right? Because, I mean, at least autos, but with steel and aluminum, certainly there are folks that are supportive. And then you would have to get that disapproval resolution through the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee in both chambers, convince the chairman to bring it up, convince leadership to put it on the floor, pass it through both chambers, and then override a presidential veto. So effectively, you need 2/3 majority in both chambers to block tariffs, and they basically go into Congress is allowed to remain passive. Let me put it that way. So the tariffs can go into effect, and Congress can just kind of not have a voice in it. So in our view, I mean, I think it's a good signaling mechanism for sure, but in our view, this is status quo. This is what we could already do right now with a regular bill. We could get rid of tariffs tomorrow if we wanted to with a bill, but again, that's a really procedurally high hurdle to get through. With approval, it's flipped, and so there's some authorities actually shifted to Congress. The president has to come to Congress and say, trade and taxation are in your purview. This is why I think these tariffs are justified. This is why, under both proposals, my Secretary of Defense says they're justified, and I think that's a good change in both of those. And then Congress can say yes or no. You would only need 41 votes in the Senate to block tariffs because you could filibuster cloture on the back end. So the motion to proceed to the vote is,
And we should mention there's also the retroactiveness
and it's
difference
retroactive.
between
I think that's going to be a sticking point.
Speaking from the perspective of the U.S. House of Representatives, we have no problem with speeding up any timeline in the U.S. Senate. So I think from our perspective, we're okay. If that's something you want to talk about, we're more than happy to have that.
No, I know. I think it's.
And I think that what we're seeing is reconcilable differences.
I think they're definitely.
And that is a huge step forward from where we were just a couple of years ago. And if we can get a package out of the Senate Finance Committee that has broad support on both sides of the aisle, you're really creating an opportunity for us to move this in a context that you can get Democratic leadership in the House a little bit more on board with. So I think what we're seeing is really the beginnings of some sort of compromise here. And the Congressman's bill, the Trade Authority Protection Act from last Congress, did try to create some privileged procedures in the Senate, but again, what do we know about that over in the House? I think that is something that he would most certainly be open to. And for him, I think this is what is critical is that we start moving forward. And that we start doing something to substantively and meaningfully restrain the president's trade authorities. I think what's really interesting about Section 232 or Section 301 is that we're using these antiquated sections of the Trade Act that predate a lot of our current day trade obligations, and it speaks to the need not just for governance reform in the sense of actually how do we get back into the process of governing, but it shows how much of our code needs just straight up modernizing, how much dead weight needs to be taken out of our authorities, because frankly, last year or at the beginning of the Trump administration, I wrote my boss a memo, and it was about the unilateral authorities Congress has delegated to the president. And the president has tried to use up every single one. These are just, they're pulled out of antiquity to rationalize behaviors they already wanted to participate in. And if we are going to leave long unused sections of the code just sitting out there for these opportunities for abuse, what we really see is the need to take some of these old things that long predate the GATT, long predate the World Trade Organization, and just take them out of the code. And I think that's part of a broader conversation that really makes sense of a conversation about legislative modernization.
Just to add to that too, I mean, Clark and Phil, you both written about this, right? Like, it's not only the fact that we do have some of these really antiquated laws on the book. I mean, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is just a Cold War era trade statute that hasn't been used by the president since 1983 until now. And I would, posit that we've had national security issues since then, and we did not need 232. But anyway, I mean, the other thing, in addition to kind of fixing some of these more antiquated statutes, is that there are also kind of just areas that are unclear. And you both have highlighted withdrawal as one of those issues as well. Where I would say constitutionally that's the power that's vested with Congress, but it's still like an argument that we're having. Like my boss has been very clear that he does not think that the president has the constitutional authority to unilaterally pull the United States out of NAFTA, but the bottom line is that's still debated.
If the president were to try to withdraw us from NAFTA, we would be debating in court.
Right.
It's just such an open conversation, and it's incredibly unclear where our trade authorities lie. And for the perspective of the House Democratic Caucus, which has complained about this issue for decades, and my boss has been sort of outside a lot of those conversations, but there's an opportunity for us to take a holistic view at our trade authorities right now and really try to create some sort of new constructive paradigm where we don't find ourselves replicating the same story over and over again, and creating a partisan divide on an issue where there really should be none. Trade for the first 150 years in U.S. history was a regional issue. A Democrat from Tennessee and a Republican from Tennessee in the next district generally are going to have the same economic incentives in their districts, and it should be about that. It shouldn't be about partisanship. People coming from communities that have struggled with the impacts of globalization, regardless of their party, should be more skeptical of globalization than people who don't. So hopefully this is a conversation that can lead to a little bit more trust amongst both parties on this issue moving forward, because the Trump administration's trade policies are a symptom of a broader problem. They didn't come out of nowhere. It was very clear in 2016 that the support for these issues had become very soft on both sides of the aisle, and it's really important for people who are committed to a rules-based global trading order to try to figure out a way to move forward from here. And I'm really glad you guys are holding this event in this context as a result. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to duck out.
Understand. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us, Hannah, and we'll continue the conversation without you. We'll say a lot of really interesting things.
We'll watch it online now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. If I may, I think a lot of what's been said is right. And what I would take a step back and say that there's actually a third option here. So on one hand, we have the Toomey bill, and on the other hand, we have the Portman bill. After the 2016 presidential campaign, I had spent all of 2015 and 16 working on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I thought that was going to move quickly during the lame duck, assuming Hillary Clinton won. Obviously, that did not happen. And so we quickly shifted into a sort of a frantic mode. And during the presidential transition, Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute, Mike Lee's office, me, Brandon Arnold from the National Taxpayers Union, the three of us sort of got together and said, okay, the president-elect has really shifted the paradigm on trade. And we need to think about an emergency measure, right? So during the campaign, the president said he was going to withdraw the United States from the WTO. He was going to withdraw the United States from NAFTA, the KORUS, the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement. and said that he wanted to impose massive sort of across-the-board tariffs, which, you know, we looked at the authorities that the president had, and you start to look and see that, wow, he actually does have a ton of unilateral authorities, again, starting with Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the national security power, but also powers under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, again, which we've used to levy tariffs on China. Section 201 safeguards, the safeguard process that we've utilized to impose tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. What we didn't attack, and so we got Senator Lee to introduce this bill, and there was no doubt, it wasn't a coincidence why the bill was released the day the president was inaugurated. We wanted to sort of send a shot across the bow, and so the bill was introduced, it didn't go anywhere, but we laid that down as a marker, and to me it's the sort of intellectual North Star, and again, disclosure, I helped draft that bill. But in many respects, it goes much, much further than the bills that we've been discussing today, which are limited to Section 232 and the trade authorities under national security. We thought that the president would, you know, potentially try to withdraw from the WTO, would potentially try to withdraw from NAFTA. So we went through and looked at every single unilateral authority outside of the anti-dumping, countervailing duties context. We didn't want to touch that, but anything where the president would have discretion to impose unilateral tariffs. And we said there needs to be a REINS-like process. We modeled it on the REINS Act, which Congress periodically debates. But it said, like, if the president wants to increase tariffs under any one of these authorities or withdraw concessions, as in withdraw from trade agreements, he's going to need the support of Congress to do that. Obviously, I still think, I have the luxury, right, of thinking about this at a think tank, but I don't have to worry about the day-to-day movement of the bill. And so, you know, I get that political reality dictates that this thing be a little more narrow. I'm more predisposed to supporting the Senator Toomey version because it's a little more aggressive than Senator Portman's bill.
Can we just go in a different direction for a second and take stock of what the administration's preferred policy on all this stuff is? Obviously, they have an institutional interest in sort of preserving their freedom that the legal status quo gives them, but they've actually got ambitions to expand that delegated authority so that they have yet new powers to shift tariffs. Can one of you speak to
I'll take the
Representative Duffy's bill and what the administration's ambitions are?
Sure. So I'll give a couple things here. I think the administration would argue, especially in the national security context, that look, this is a widely accepted legal principle and it makes perfect sense. Adam Smith, the godfather of free trade, in The Wealth of Nations, writes about the need potentially to protect an industry in the case of a national security emergency. So it's not implausible to think that, you know, the United States should block the trade, the export, for instance, of nuclear fissionable material, right? Like, that makes sense. It's also the case that the World Trade Organization and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which predates the World Trade Organization, in 1947, the United States was drafting the GATT, and we were adamant that there needs to be some sort of national security exemption from generally applicable trade rules in the case of an emergency or a national security context. I would caution, though, that I think that that's potentially been misused in certain circumstances. I think the potential for auto tariffs under Section 232 is a really, really dangerous precedent, right? I think that's really crazy. But I do think that if you look at aluminum, for instance, right? If the administration would say that there's not enough capacity domestically to produce this stuff that we need in military applications, and if we are reliant on imports, what happens if, you know, like suppliers dry up, they stop selling it to us? So they would argue that we need this stuff for national security purposes, and we want to incentivize domestic production of it. I'm less sympathetic about that claim as it relates to steel. I don't know enough about the uranium context, and then the United States just opened up a case that Haley mentioned earlier on titanium sponge, which again has a military application. That I would differentiate though, in the sense that that was not self-initiated by the Department of Commerce. It was the industry came to the Department of Commerce and said, this is a problem for us. Again, by distinguishing that, I would say that in the context of auto, steel, and aluminum, the industry did not petition the Department of Commerce to open this investigation. That was a directive from the White House to the Department of Commerce. As it relates to Congressman Sean Duffy has introduced a bill, the Reciprocal Trade Act. Basically what it would do is it would allow the United States to say, okay, the classic example is the United States imposes a maximum tariff on automobile imports of 2.5%. The European Union imposes a tariff of 10%. We've agreed to that at the WTO. We think that's unfair for our auto industry, faces massive barriers abroad. So the president, on a product-by-product basis, should be authorized to raise tariffs to match the level imposed by our trading partner on that particular product. So it would delegate more authority to the executive branch, and the theory is that will then create an incentive for those countries to negotiate to lower their tariffs, because as it stands now, the United States can't get other countries to lower their tariffs. I think there are a couple major problems with that. First, if you look at the average tariff in the United States compared to our major trading partners, it's about equal, right? On a trade-weighted basis, it's about equal. It just depends on which particular product. And so in these trade negotiations, we have decided to sort of cherry pick, and we say, we're going to protect this industry, and this other country says we're going to protect this industry, and we're going to have higher tariffs there. And those are just political calculations. There's no sort of rhyme or reason to that. And so, again, they want to go out and claim that the United States has much lower tariffs, but that's not actually the case. It just depends. And the other problem here is, we get into this position where they claim this is how countries are going to negotiate. Facts and sort of trade history belie that, right? The United States has been enormously successful in negotiating trade agreements for the last 70 or 80 years, and it hasn't done so under the threat of tariff. We bring countries in, we sit them down across the table. We have a ton to offer. We have the largest, most attractive market in the entire world, and countries want access to that. So if you go back and look at the NAFTA context, the United States had much lower tariffs to begin with than Mexico did. But Mexico wanted access to the United States market, and we said, that's fine, you gotta bring them all down to zero, and we'll bring them all down to zero. And 98% of trade between the United States and Mexico trades duty-free. And so we have a history, we know how to do this. The United States led this process, and it's been relatively successful. It hasn't been perfect, but it's been relatively successful.
Thanks. Haley, do you have any thoughts on the future of the Reciprocal Trade Act in the Senate Finance Committee?
I haven't heard of any Senate sponsors yet, so we'll see. My boss actually did put out a tweet on the Reciprocal Trade Act, which was along the lines of, we've already delegated too much authority to the president on trade. We don't need to delegate more authority to the executive generally, right, on trade. The one thing I'd comment too is on the Reciprocal Trade Act, not only, are tariffs not necessarily a good negotiating tactic, as we've seen, because there's a lot of collateral damage in the interim, but also it flies in the face of our MFN commitments at the WTO, which actually were enshrined in U.S. law in 1922 before the GATT. So I found that piece of history interesting. I know Dan Griswold has put out a good piece on that.
Just so everybody is aware, I get it, I'm a trade lawyer, so I think and talk about MFN and most favored nation. Basically, the most favored nation principle is that the United States or WTO members can't discriminate against similar products from other WTO members. So if we impose a 5% tariff on a widget coming from China, we have to apply that same tariff, that 5% tariff, to every WTO member. There are limited exceptions, so the United States has preferential trade agreements like NAFTA and the CAFTA and a host of other sort of bilateral trade agreements, but that's an exception to that rule that you can't discriminate against similar products coming from other WTO members, just so folks are aware.
But you can't claim a national security exemption for it like you arguably could for 232.
Right, yes, yes, that's the other point there.
Well, I want to make sure we leave time to take some questions from our stalwart audience who made it through the security barriers to get here today. Any questions from the audience? I have some questions of my own if nobody does, but I'd love to give you a chance. Yes.
Clark, but you two also, I'm interested in your take on TPP. What was your take and what is your take now?
Sure. I was very much in support of the TPP for a couple reasons. I think the most important trading relationship in that the whole agreement was between the United States and Japan. I mean, it would have updated NAFTA essentially, and so we wouldn't have wasted USTR's time renegotiating NAFTA. It essentially did all that. One of the things I would say though that I really liked about it, and by way of background, I was in Geneva, Switzerland last week at the WTO, and there's a general frustration, with multilateralism and multilateral trade at the WTO. I viewed the TPP and these major regional trade agreements as a nice counterbalance to that. It would force, the United States could have leveraged that to then put leverage on China to raise its commercial standards. And if you're not, then it also creates leverage against the WTO. Say, it's time for you guys to start modernizing. And if you're not going to work to negotiate at the WTO, then we're going to move on. That we can't just allow this, under a globalized economy, we can't just stand still. And so this was our way of trying to jumpstart negotiations at the WTO. I was very sympathetic to it. I get that the politics were not great.
Comment on TPP?
Yeah.
I was not a staffer during TPP, so.
You can be relieved of that question. I have a question. One of the most remarkable things to me about the 232 tariffs was having Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross go on television pretty much say, this is crucial to our national security because it affects our economic security. And economic security is pretty much an integral component of our national security, so there you go.
Right.
And he pretty much came out and said that in so many words, which I thought was very surprising. It seemed like a naked admission of sort of manipulating something in the statute. But then when Clark and I were writing our paper, and we went to the text of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, it is remarkably mushy language. So I just wondered sort of whether either of you had any insights on why that language was put in there. Perhaps you got at the reason when you said that was very much a Cold Warrior statute, and sort of that was one aspect of the Toomey bill that I know we haven't spoken about yet. So maybe
Yeah. So that is one of our concerns, right? Because if you're going to construe, and I don't disagree that there may be circumstances where that is true, but I think that if you're defining national security that broadly for the context of a unilateral trade authority, right? You are kind of wading into dangerous territory, and that's what we've seen. I think it goes. A lot of times the administration hasn't even used that justification. Like they've just said, these tariffs are leverage, and that's obviously this isn't the Tariffs Are Leverage Act of 1962. So. And so there is really, when I was going through the statute, when we were kind of putting together the revamped bill for this Congress, because there are a lot of improvements, in my view, on the Corker-Toomey proposal, we did see that and I just pulled up the bill, or in the statute right now, it says the Secretary and the President shall further recognize the close relation of the economic welfare of the nation to our national security, and shall take into consideration the impact of foreign competition on the economic welfare of individual domestic industries and any substantial unemployment, decreasing revenues of government, loss of skills or investment, or other serious effects resulting from the displacement of any domestic products by excessive imports.
I like that you can read that even though it has a big red line.
Right, and we were like, okay, well, let's get rid of that. And then we put in what we view as a flexible definition of national security that basically attempted to get at this question to bifurcate national defense needs from general economic welfare, and there's a Supreme Court precedent for that if you look at Colby-Young from 1956. So that's what we looked at. I mean, it's a starting point for the conversation, but I think that should be a piece of the discussion when we're looking at how this statute has been used and how it should be used, and how, what the intent really was there. So yeah.
If I were in the White House counsel's office, I would be going apoplectic all the time about the president going out of his way to tweet that. I mean, after leaving the G7 last year in Canada, he tweeted that the United States imposed the tariffs as they relate to Canada, given in response to how Canada treats our dairy farmers. And so he openly admitted that the national security claim, which is a really, really broad and very serious claim, was nothing more than a negotiating ploy. And if I'm the lawyer having to stand up in the Court of International Trade and try to defend that, I mean, if I were the petitioner's lawyer, I would basically say Exhibit 1 is that tweet where he admitted that this had nothing to do with American national security. But when he's on message, I mean, he's a little better, but he just, I guess he's just not disciplined enough to understand the legal arguments, the very serious legal arguments that they are making, and he just perpetually undercuts that with sort of silly tweets. And again, it's not meant to, as Haley said, I mean, it's a really good way of putting it, that it's not the Trade Leverage Act or the Tariff Leverage Act of 1962. And so we need to think seriously about that. The United States, when it put in place Article 21 of the GATT, and then this article, or Section 232, is sort of modeled on that. Other countries have tried to invoke this abroad to restrict our products, our exports, and the United States went around at the WTO and basically told countries, please, please, please do not use this. This authority needs to be used judiciously and sparingly. That's kind of the standard that the United States has always applied, because it's not that out of the realm, right, for Japan to say, well, our troops need rice. They eat rice, so we're going to protect a sensitive Japanese industry, the rice industry. You can think about it in the context of the EU and data, right? Data is a huge issue in Europe right now. And you can envision them, the European Union, basically saying, we're going to, on national security grounds, we are going to restrict the free flow of data across border. And so, the United States was always the moral authority on this. We wrote the authority, and we very rarely used it. And we had the authority to basically say, we're not going to use this unless it's a really serious case, and we refrain from doing that. And so now we've kind of opened Pandora's box. This has been challenged at the WTO, and it's going to put the WTO in a terrible bind in its dispute settlement system. And then if that goes through and they basically give license to the United States to do this, I would envision every country pick out whatever domestic industry you want to protect, claim national security, and you'll be able to exempt yourself from otherwise applicable trade rules.
Well, and don't forget the carbon emissions.
Yeah, I saw the Congress, someone in Congress suggested that the United States look at the importation of carbon emissions as a threat to American national security, sort of pivoting this back on the White House. Unfortunately, it's not a tradable good under the GATT, but still, I mean, there are lots of fun ways to kind of think through.
And this is all the more reason that I would just to plug my boss's bill again, that Congress should be approving these actions on the front end, because then you don't have the kind of the decision concentrated in one individual or in one industry that might be powerful, whatever it is, right? I mean, titanium, sponge, and uranium were both requested by domestic industry. And so, like you said, you open the door for, if this is validated, right, you open the door for kind of everyone to ask for their own, 232 investigation. And we already have ABCBD for these kinds of things.
Right.
But what happens, though, if you shift it to Congress and basically require a simple majority in the House and the Senate to approve, then every single lawmaker is having some say over how this impacts their constituents and how their constituents are essentially taxed. And that kind of dispersion of decision-making, I think, helps a lot as far as pushing back against kind of more concentrated protectionist impulses.
Mm-hmm. If I may, just one last comment. I think that I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about China in the context of all of this, and I think that the United States has very real and serious, long-standing complaints about how China engages, its commercial practices and commercial standards are not up to par with Western countries. One of the things I would caution, though, is that it sort of outside the context of trade, but in the CFIUS context, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States just upped the standards in what was known as FIRMA last year. And so the United States is looking at tools on whether it be export control or the concern is predatory investment by Chinese companies and state-owned enterprises in the United States in high-tech products. And so the idea being that they get their claws into a company and force the transfer of technology away from the United States into, and you don't know exactly where the fault lines are. Is this a private company because they have so many state-owned enterprises and they're so tightly controlled and intertwined with the Communist Party? But I would say that we need to think through the national security angle on this, because again, I do have concerns that China does engage in predatory investment, and that can potentially pose national security threat to the United States. But you have to figure out how to distinguish between legitimate concerns and more protectionist concerns that we're just going to block Chinese investment in this company because we don't want the Chinese to invest in the United States. And so it's a tough and delicate balancing act there.
Yeah, and Senator Toomey tried to attach the REINS Act to FIRMA, if you recall. So, because this was mostly our banking team working on this issue, but just because we did give CFIUS more rulemaking authority under FIRMA, he thought it was reasonable that Congress should have at least some mechanism to approve that.
One last chance for questions from the audience. I have one more question. I'll just ask sort of the open-ended question of sort of in terms of the politics of taking this battle forward. What are the next steps? We heard Tom talk earlier about sort of the last step in the game would be trying to assemble a coalition of sort of folks who are skeptical of where executive power has gotten, and free traders, and maybe cobble together a majority from that. But what are the intermediate steps before we can get to that, working through the committees?
Yeah, so also, I guess I can speak more to the Senate side. And I think, I obviously don't speak for Chairman Grassley, but I think he's been pretty clear publicly that he's interested in doing something on 232, and that he's looking for some consensus product on 232, because that's kind of the battleground right now, Section 232. Like you said, Clark, it'd be great if we could, pass the Lee bill, of which Senator Toomey was a co-sponsor, but I think that maybe too broad to feasibly get through Congress, at least with a veto-proof majority. But 232 is the battleground, and like I said, Chairman Grassley's been clear that it is something he wants to move on. The Toomey bill and the Portman bill both have bipartisan co-sponsors. We have 4 members of the Finance Committee as originals on ours. But I also think we're reaching a tipping point. We reached our tipping point on 232 a while ago, but you're seeing more and more members become frustrated because the president has put in place a lot of tariffs under 232, under 301, but he hasn't removed any of them. And we thought the 232, at least on Canada and Mexico, were going to go away when USMCA was signed, and that hasn't happened. And to my knowledge, all that's, the replacement is going to be a quotas regime, which is arguably even worse than tariffs, especially if they're not TRQs. And if the quotas, even if the quotas are generous, it's like, there's still a trade restriction that needs to be administered, and it becomes very bureaucratic. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds, but my point is, I think there's a frustration with that, with the steel and aluminum tariffs, especially not being gone on our allies. There's a frustration. If the autos report comes out with an affirmative finding, and I don't know what it says, but I suspect that it will likely have an affirmative finding based on what I've read. That is going to be a huge tipping point. And then the final piece of the puzzle as well is USMCA, because the president really wants it to move, and there's potentially a nexus in the implementing legislation to do something on 232. I don't know, but I think there's kind of a confluence of factors coming together. And as Hannah said earlier, you kind of see a weird coalition forming of allies on trade policy, that you wouldn't normally see under most circumstances. Because you have Republicans that are traditionally free traders, and then Democrats some Democrats are free traders, like Representative Kind traditionally, but then also folks that are skeptical of how the president has used some of this unilateral authority. And then obviously that authority has been really pushed too. It has not been used in a restrained manner. So I just think you have all these factors coming together, and that you're going to see some action. And it's very positive that Chairman Grassley wants to be working on this. So
I would offer just a note of caution on this, and I'm supportive of any of this and all of this. The word of caution is, if we want to do this, we need a big enough coalition to signal to the leader McConnell, that it's worth putting this on the floor. My sense is the White House would not be thrilled about this and would ask him to block this. Now, you can overcome that in the sense that, like, if it passes out of the Finance Committee on a unanimous vote or close to that, and the sort of soft whip count shows, well, there are 75, 80 of us that are supportive, then McConnell's got to move on it. But if it's not as soft or not as firm, and there is sort of a soft underbelly of people who could go either way, my sense is the White House, Senator McConnell would try to protect the White House from sort of embarrassing him. In the House, it's a different animal. I have been open, and I've worked closely with Hannah and other free trading Democrats. My hope is that if nothing else, they have a political incentive to shoot this over to the Senate, pass it, even if it's on a partisan vote that doesn't have a veto-proof majority. I think it sends a really powerful signal, because over the last 2 years, no one has fought, and we haven't really gotten a binding vote on this, and despite the efforts of good free trading members of Congress, I think the political incentive in the House may be a little stronger to kind of send something over. And just getting people on the record, I think, is a good first step here. So that's what I leave this with.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to those of us who are watching online, or in the future watching online. And look out for more information about future meetings of Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group. And please do check out our policy papers at rstreet.org, and you can find out about more depth on these issues. And again, comment cards if you have thoughts about what we should be doing going forward.